I'm delighted to welcome you to this climate change reporting webinar, which is a practical guide for property practitioners, and partly this was in response to another event that we did where we with some residential conveyancers as well who asked for further guidance on that. So if you're joining having been to that event, then really nice to see you here today. So a lot of this comes on the back, of course, the Law Society guidance that's been published for solicitors and what that means and understanding those implications. And so today I'm delighted to welcome Sally Redman and Mark Taylor from the Landmark Information Group, who are going to be taking you through all of that. So they're going to be looking at Law Society climate change guidance, what that means, how that impacts in terms of advising your client, reporting to the client, what Landmark can do in terms of their reports to help you, and also some continued learning on that. So I think without further ado, I think Mark, I understand that you're speaking first. So let me hand over to you. Feel free to introduce yourself in fuller terms to the audience, and I hope you enjoyed today's session, and there'll be a feedback form as well at the end, so please do let us know what you think and if there's anything else you would like on the back of this session. Thank you very much, everybody. Mark, over to you.
Brilliant, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure for you to take 45 minutes to an hour out of your day. I know you're all really busy people, so again, thank you so much for your time, and thank you for Bristol Law Society for organising this event. Yes, we're here to talk about climate change, and it is becoming, I suppose, quite a contentious topic. But you know, with the guidance that's out there, you know, it's important to read, understand, and start to, I suppose, embed what it says into your practice. So, what will we look to cover today in the first half of the session? Really, we hope to just, I suppose, simplify the guidance, you know, provide some definitions to some of the language and terminology that's used within it. Then look at, I suppose, what it might mean to practitioners and what practical steps can be taken to make sure that we're following the duties that we know are well established, just in the context really of climate change. So in the first half, hopefully we'll interpret the guidance for you and how you can start to advise your clients on climate risks, and I suppose what elements of risk are referenced within the guidance. In the second half, I hand over to my colleague Sally, and she will go through how you can start feeding this information back to your clients using our reports, and start to discuss, you know, why we've done what we've done, what kind of features are in our report, and where we can add value in terms of the topics that could be classed as relevant to a climate search. So in the first instance, let's quickly just look at the Law Society guidance itself. As you may know, this was released on the 19th of April, and I presume most people obviously are aware of that, but hopefully have read it or started to go through it. There were consultees during the process of its creation, and one of those consultees was UKLA, United Kingdom Environmental Law Association, who would have provided some recommendations off the back of that review. And we're fortunate that our legal director, Simon Boyle, who's a former practicing environmental lawyer, was able to be part of that. And I think in the first instance, you know, it's fairly hefty guidance. It's longer than others that have been provided for topics or issues such as contaminated land and flooding. But also, what's really important to understand is it's in two, I suppose, quite distinct parts. In the first instance, your part A, which is about reducing greenhouse gas emissions and what kind of advice you might start considering with your clients. And then part B, which is the focus of this session, which is around, I suppose, how to advise clients in respect to climate change risks that could be present in a transaction. I think you could suggest these could have been two separate documents, because it's quite a chunky piece of guidance. However, I think it does work as a combination, because part B is really looking at what the impacts of climate change could be, and so it's really, you know, what physical risks could change. You know, what do we need to do to control, what kind of world we end up in. But part A is really the front of that. It is, what steps are we going to make to manage our emissions, to manage the transition to a net zero economy. And the reason why that's important is because if you get that bit right, then you're gonna minimise the future change, and then you'll minimise the potential future physical impact. So part A, looking at greenhouse gas emissions and what advice can be provided in terms of reducing those, fits in terms of the story of transitioning well to reduce physical change and reduce the impact of climate change. So I do think it does make sense in the way it's structured. So first question, who should read the guidance? Well, quite a simple answer. Really, everyone in the Law Society should be reading this. It's not specific to any sector, and it's basically saying that all solicitors need to start thinking about climate change and the impacts it could have on the work they do. And so obviously in this case, real estate or residential property transactions. So simple answer to that question. Solicitors need to start thinking about climate change, and if you haven't already, we really would recommend reading the guidance in the first instance. One thing to note about the guidance is again, it's quite general at the moment, and what it does say within it is there will be future releases of sector-specific guidance. It is thought that one of the first of these is likely to be on property, and we've been told that this practice note has already been drafted, but with a release date that is unknown. Current understanding, I think, is that this is likely to be towards the end of the year, but not too sure on that. But again, our understanding is that it's not going to be like, you know, your contaminated land guidance or your flood risk guidance, where it's kind of saying you should be looking to do this in every case. Instead, what it's likely to be doing is fleshing out what is already mentioned in the guidance. I think an area where it will elaborate on is providing more information on specific risks that it might consider to be relevant to property. At the moment, it splits between several risks, physical, transition, and which we'll talk about in a bit more detail. But in terms of what the makeup of that is, it's quite limited at the moment. So I think it will delve into that a bit more. Some firms we know are approaching this guidance and climate risks as waiting on sector-specific guidance. And those doing so, it's very unlikely to be saying, in this case, you should be doing A, B, and C. In another case, you should be doing, you know, A, B, C, and D. So therefore, when you go back to my point on the last slide, our advice would be, you know, to start to review, well, read the guidance, start to review how you think you want to start approaching this as a firm, if you haven't already started doing that, because sector-specific guidance could be a few months away just yet. So moving on to advising your client, so looking at part B of the guidance. Before we, I suppose, delve into that, I think it's important just to frame and add a bit of context around climate change. And an important part of that is obviously a little bit about science and why climate change is an issue being brought forward. And behind the targets, behind the commitments, the policy and the legislation that is coming out of government is really the science. And those with probably most expertise in the area reporting to the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Their first report was back in 1990, and the snippet on this slide, which I've attached, is from the latest IPCC report, which was published earlier in this year and is their 6th census report. And one key thing to note really about climate change is over recent years and recent decades, well, since that first report in 1990, there's been quite a significant substantial language change and a significant increase in the voice of urgency around the topic and a reaction that we need to do as a global community. Gone are the phrases of probably happening and probably because of anthropogenic activities, and that's changed to a lot more certainty. Just reading off the slide and the snippet, human activities principally through emissions of greenhouse gases have unequivocally caused global warming, with global surface temperatures reaching 1.1 degree above pre-industrial levels. And so unequivocally, you know, the scientists are now saying, you know, there is no doubt that we are causing this, and therefore if we're causing this, we're perhaps in control in terms of reducing that change that we might see. Just picking up on that 1.1 degree as well, if we think of 1.1 degree into the context of you know, daily temperature, it doesn't seem that important, doesn't seem that much, and I think it's hard it makes it hard to resonate. But if we put that in terms of the context of the Paris Agreement, the Paris Agreement originally was 2 degrees and has been changed to be well below 2 degrees with a target of achieving 1.5 degree temperature increase above pre-industrial levels. So if we're already at 1.1 degrees in the context of the Paris Agreement, we're already over 2/3 of the way there. And I think that just emphasizes the magnitude of the journey we've been on, and I suppose the magnitude of the journey we need to achieve in terms of minimizing the future climate change and future temperature increases that we see as a global community again. So going back to the guidance, and within the guidance really there's 3 different types of risk that are, I suppose, referenced within it. In the first instance, it mentions physical, It then starts to talk about transition, which might be new, some new terminology to people, and there's also obviously the litigation side of things. And so starting with the physical elements of risk, with the exception of heat stress or heat-related risks, most of these, I imagine, everyone will be familiar with either through environmental reports or news publishings. And so these are all risks that already could happen in any given year. And essentially, what climate change is expected to do is to make these incidents perhaps more frequent, but also more extreme. And so just going through these left to right, if you start with flooding, as it says there, frequent and intense rainfall events. And so the impact of climate change on flooding is really likely to be twofold. In the first instance, we're likely to experience milder but wetter winters, so more rainfall during the winter months. However, alongside that, we're also expected to see drier, hotter summers. Now, whilst that might mean less rainfall in the summer months, what this might lead to, or could lead to, is more flash flooding events. Hotter months leads to hardening, obviously, of topsoils, and hardening topsoils is difficult for rainwater to infiltrate. And so with lower infiltration rates of rainfall, you're going to generate more runoff, resulting in more flash flooding events, as well as more erosion of those topsoils. Going through to subsidence, this could be geology dependent, and an area of focus at the moment is within shrink swell of clays, and effectively greater saturation of the ground will cause more swelling, and then the drying out will result in more shrinking. This is projected to result in greater ground movement through this shrink swell response of clay geologies. Moving through coastal erosion, there are inevitably areas of the coast which are naturally susceptible to erosion due to coastal processes and the susceptibility of the geology in that area. And these risks, I suppose, have shot to prominence this year especially, and has received widespread news attention due to what is happening in areas of the country, most notably in areas Hensby and Norfolk, where properties are being vacated and demolished before these coastal processes cause, I suppose, instability and destability of properties in those areas. Sea level increase through ice caps melting, thermal expansion, as well as more extreme and frequent storms will likely worsen the erosion of these susceptible coastal areas. Moving through onto heat, I suppose whilst it's not something we necessarily look at the moment from an environmental perspective when we're looking at property transactions, but I suppose it's quite an easy one to communicate and to explain. If it's hotter outside, buildings will get hotter inside unless there is suitable ventilation to manage the airflow within those properties, or also suitable shading. However, one area which is something that isn't too, I suppose, not familiar, that's probably the wrong word, but isn't discussed that much in this country, and we're definitely not exposed to it like other countries, is wildfire. And interestingly, this is something that the current guidance actually makes reference to. It can be a potential issue in certain areas of the country, and this is shown by the summer of 2022, where 16 homes in Wellington and Havering were destroyed in one of the blazes on the 19th of July in 2022. So our susceptibility of the country to wildfires could increase through obviously hotter temperatures and drier environments. At this point, I think it's important just to touch on the data, because this is obviously really important from, I suppose, analysis and an assessment standpoint. And the Met Office data, UKCP 18, United Kingdom Climate Projections 18, powers the climate change assessments. And what I just wanted to get across to you is within this data, there are 4 different scenarios in effect, which play out 4 different outcomes and which play out 4 different future scenarios. And as you can see, each scenario leads to a different temperature environment. At the bottom, you have RCP 2.6, representative concentration rate pathway to 2.6, which is an emission scenario linked to the Paris Agreement. And at the top, you have RCP 8.5, which is effectively emissions continue to grow unmitigated. Within those, you have 2 intermediate scenarios, which relate to different levels of mitigation being implemented. Now, the reason why this is important to understand is that obviously in a more extreme scenario or a more mitigated scenario will lead to very different outcomes of, I suppose, future climate change or future climate impact on risk. Therefore, when adopting a policy, this should be an important consideration to know and understand and be aware of, because effectively what it will impact is the outcome and the information you'll be returning to your client. And as I said, if it is a more extreme scenario, or if it's a lower scenario, you could get quite different future changes based upon what scenario is being used within an assessment to drive or generate that assessment. Moving through, so that just quickly touches on physical risk. I think that will be quite well known to most people. The second element of risk really is transitional risk, and most likely to be the new terminology to a lot of property lawyers and conveyancers. And while new, it is still an important issue to be aware of and to consider if or when reporting on climate risks. I think there is an element of I suppose, confusion perhaps around what transition risk means. I think there could be some simplification in terms of the definition, which could make this a bit clearer. But there are a couple of descriptions which I think are really helpful in terms of understanding what transition risk means. And so, firstly, just quoting the Bank of England, so I think that separates out really well. You can think of these as changes that governments, industries, and consumers make in pursuit of a greener world. As well as that, the UK government's climate change strategy 2021 to 2024 says transition risks are the financial risks which could result from the process of adjustment towards a lower carbon economy, including changes in policy and technology, which could prompt a reassessment of asset values and lead to stranded assets. So simply put, transition risks are changes that need to occur to policy, regulation and technology to reach our net zero targets. And so in relation to real estate, and I suppose what the perception, or sensitivity, more importantly, of risks, such as flooding, does change, and that is going to be a continuous thing that both individuals and businesses respond to. The risk or issue surrounding real estate, the lower carbon economy, in pursuit of a greener world, energy efficiency is the key transition risk of concern to real estate, as we will need to reduce the carbon output of both commercial and domestic properties to reach our net zero targets and obligations. And so there are existing laws to make it illegal to lease commercial properties that have an energy performance certificate rating that is either F or G, and government white papers on changes to these have already been consulted on, which will have big implications to the private rented sector for both domestic properties and commercial real estate. And also a lot will need to be done if the government wants to meet their aspirations for as many homes as possible to reach EPC Band C by 2035. In terms of where this is in the guidance, so this is laid out in the guidance within Part B 2.1, climate change risks and climate legal risks. Firstly, it states that in this guidance we address climate legal risks. However, climate change transition and climate change physical risks will impact upon the solicitor's consideration of climate legal risks. From this, it then goes on into several bullet points addressing certain topics of potential risk. Now, while there is a subheading for physical risk, there is not one for transition. I think this would have been useful, especially given transition risk is referenced, just like physical risk, in a very clear and consistent manner throughout the guidance. But it is important to note that minimum energy efficiency standards are covered by the guidance in this section, and was in the subheading new climate related legislation and regulations just below physical risk. And so while it means it's not new legislation, I suppose it's saying that changing current energy efficiency standards legislation would constitute as new. In the back of the guidance, there are annexes. So 5.3 Annex 3 provides a checklist for legal practices, which effectively there to provide a quick checklist to assist with implementing the guidance, and this refers directly back to, again, physical and transition risks. So as I said, the guidance is very clear and consistent with its terminology, and it states in the back of the report in this annex, have you reviewed the physical and transition risks associated with the transaction? So again, there is consistency in what is being communicated. And before we move on, I just wanted to highlight why transition risk is really important, because we touched on it at the beginning. And effectively, it's because more needs to be done. Analysis of current UK policy has concluded that targets have not been matched by effective policy. The House of Lords Industry and Regulators Committee published a report called the Net Zero Transformation Delivery Regulation and the Consumer Report, really catchy title. But that stated that the government is likely to miss its targets for reducing emissions to net zero by 2050 unless it puts in place credible plans which are needed to encourage essential investments by consumers and businesses. In June last year, the Committee on Climate Change assessed the government's plans for reducing emissions in all sectors of the economy. They found that only 39% of the required emission savings are backed up by credible plans and policies. The Committee on Climate Change states that a key area of concern is buildings where emissions have not fallen significantly in over a decade. So what does this mean? Well, we've already mentioned that the UK government consultation papers, and they were out in 2020 and 2021. However, I suppose what this means is that if further policy fails or are not aligned to meet the targets we've set, it is likely or even inevitable that more stringent policy may well be needed to be implemented as we lose time at a faster rate. So just checking time. The third type of risk, liability risk, and so climate change litigation could be and is already being brought about by people bringing claims against businesses. This can come in many forms, can include things like greenwashing, which is mentioned in part A of the guidance. But I suppose answering this question in terms of real estate, how could they potentially arise? Well, on this slide, we've suggested a few ways in which legal liability for law firms may come to light from climate change, I suppose, when looking at real estate. But overall, I suppose the main risk is not being alert to climate change issues, and having read the guidance and taking it into account, and implementing a policy. If that's followed, I suppose none of these should really happen. But just reading a few of them out. Now the guidance has been published, I suppose failing to exclude or warn of climate change risks in a retainer, and then not considering climate change risks during this transaction could be a route for liability. There's an argument to say that failing to consider climate change risk in obvious locations could be a potential mechanism. I suppose in areas of the coast where it's well known, for example, that erosion is happening. Let's take Hemsby. That is clearly an area where it should be, or perhaps is a key consideration. Failing to advise a client on the risks identified in the climate change search. Now, I suppose this is similar to the bird and bird case. If you are obtaining a search, then it's important to make sure that information is effectively passed on to your client so that can inform their decision-making processes. And then final one, failure to advise the client on other climate change risks identified in other due diligence. So it might not be through something that you've obtained necessarily, it could be through third-party pre-contract inquiries. But again, in relation to point 3, the third point, any information that's responded in relation to climate change, important that, especially if that's adverse, to pass it on to the client to make sure they are made aware of it so they can inform their decisions. I'm just going to quickly fly for this next section because what the guidance does do is reiterate duties. Now, I imagine these are all very, very familiar to you, and I suppose what the guidance is really saying is that you need to be, we're going to bring awareness of these duties back to you, but just in the context of climate change. So really, the guidance is just saying you need to be alert to these potential issues. So in the first instance, duty of care, I presume you all know that solicitors may have to look beyond the narrow scope of instruction by a client to consider whether and to what extent climate legal risks are relevant. So yes, I'm sure you all know you have a duty of care to your clients, and that now extends to climate change risks. 3.2 Part B, duty to warn. Again, I'm sure you'll be aware of your duty to warn, and the guidance makes it clear that this needs to extend to cover climate change risks. And so now that guidance has been published, you need to read it. You need to be aware that there are searches that can be obtained if required. And basically, you need to be aware of the risk because your client may not. On the other case, I suppose on the flip side, your client may have their own expertise in their organisation, and you may not need to cover it based on that those specific cases. But however, really what it's saying is simply you start raising the question to your clients, have you started thinking about climate change? And we have client care wording that can support that. Part B 3.3, duty to disclose, probably the most important one. If you're getting a climate change report and it has important information in there, this needs to be extracted and sent to them. If a report is being sent, making sure the client is being made aware of what concern may be present. My colleague Sally will be touching on that in a second. But finally, what I think is quite an important one is duty to uphold service and competency levels. And I think the thing to pull out from here is that there's an understanding in the guidance. Solicitors may not, and in a lot of cases, won't have experience or knowledge of training, or training in place to provide the service levels on climate change, and therefore upskilling is going to be required. And there is specific wording, I suppose, an acknowledgement of this. And so therefore, there's an expectation really that law firms will need to adapt and ensure that there is a process in place for, I suppose, an increase in competency and knowledge around climate risk. And therefore, things like the Landmark Academy, which we'll talk about at the end, could really be helpful for that. And just finally touching on what it says in terms of property due diligence, well, it doesn't actually say a huge amount. So basically, could a search be needed? And so therefore, start to think about, it's using your professional judgment and setting a policy and discussing with your client as to when this is needed. But consider the impacts of physical events on conveyancing transactions. Is a climate search needed? Address the impact of climate events on the property within your advice. For instance, the property is on a floodplain, address increasing flood risk incidents, cost and availability of insurance, and how this affects the decision to buy and the price. So again, start to have these conversations with your client after reading read the guidance. Very conscious of time, but effectively, the guidance does not say it is necessary to undertake a climate search at all times. And really, it is up for the firm to set a policy and set out what it thinks is appropriate. And therefore, different approaches can be taken, but obviously it's important to understand that there's that duty to warn, and obviously if you do obtain information, to make sure that is disclosed to your client when you do. But there is really a big acknowledgement that there's going to be competency and training gaps over this topic, which will need to be fulfilled, and it does comment and make allowance to that. And so just finally, we have created client care wording, which is, I suppose, flexible to whatever policy you want to implement. It allows a firm to warn of the risks of climate change to your clients, but then have a policy that fits how you want to adopt obtaining searches going forward. And so they really are warning the client and then waiting for them to request a search, warning the client and then stating you're going to include a search unless they don't want it, and then option three, warning the client and then saying we're not going to include it unless you specifically want one. So what our client care wording, we hope, does is allow firms to warn their clients, but also then adopt and implement a policy that that best fits the service levels they want to provide around climate change risks. So now we're going to quickly pop up a quick poll for you. And so really, we just want to get a really good idea of just what are you thinking at the moment, whether you've implemented a policy, whether you've had a discussion around climate change at all. And I suppose, what do you think as a policy best fits your current opinions around climate change reporting? And so what those options will be are those we just discussed. Are you going to recommend a search and wait for instruction from a client? Is it something you're going to look to do by default and then wait for clients to say they don't want it? Or is it something that you're going to warn on, but then not necessarily look to do unless you are specifically asked to cover it? So if you could answer that poll as it comes up, that would be great. But after that, I'm going to hand over to my colleague Sally, who's just going to take over. No responses so far. Sorry, everyone. If you could quickly just pop an answer in. Thank you. If we could start to answer that really quickly, that'd be wonderful. Oh, that's 3. A few more responses, please, everyone. Okay, Sally, I'm aware of time, yeah. So do you want to start
that's
taking
fine.
Thank you, those who answered that poll. Thank you very much.
Okay, so can everyone see my screen? Mark, can you see it?
Yeah.
Lovely, thank you. So the next couple of sections now will just be going through how to report climate change risks to your client. So first off, we're assuming that you've obtained a a climate change report. So the thing to do then is to review what the climate change risks are highlighted within the report. What does the report cover, and are there any changes in terms of what the current day says, whether it's low to moderate, and then in 2050 it increases to a moderate risk or higher potentially. Secondly, then it's being able to email a copy of the climate change report to your client and then alerting them to any of those changes in the risk rating over time. Just because a potential increase in risk could then potentially lead to increased insurance premiums. So something that your client does need to be aware of. And then it's about copying and pasting the summary of that report into your report on title. Now, there's guidance out there. The Chancery Lane project has a number of examples out there for drafting for climate change, and this particular one, Marnie's clause, is for those where a climate change report has been requested by the client, and a solicitor can use this particular clause to show what risks have been highlighted within the report and how those risks have changed. So here you can see you've got physical risks, and you can really kind of detail what risks have been highlighted within the report, and then go through how those risks have changed from current day to 2050. There's also a section on there about transition risks, which Mark's gone through, but in particular they're looking at changes to insurability and property value and cost to maintain a retrofit. And I'll show you through the presentation an example of what we class as a transition risk. So when including the results of a climate change report, this is an example of something that you could say. So we've carried out a landmark climate change report. This identified the following risks and then identify what those risks are. And then we recommend that you speak to a contact or a consultant at Landmark if you have any questions about the report or the risks identified. Now, you could potentially speak to a surveyor, but as we have in-house environmental consultants at Landmark and we're used to reporting on environmental risks, we're writing the climate change reports as well. So we're very used to understanding what those risks mean and how the report's produced and the next steps. And so we're very happy to speak to yourselves or to your clients about climate change risks. So please feel free to do so if you have any questions. And then on the report on title, the main things really to copy and paste are any changes in risk ratings at all, or even if you just want to kind of highlight if there's, even if they're the same, but this is an example of a section on our page talking about flood risk. You can either copy and paste it or kind of state it within the report on title about what those risks are and how it's potentially changed. But just going through the climate change report itself, the report is available for both residential and commercial properties, and the climate change risks within these different versions are exactly the same, but we have tailored advice. So for instance, for EPC, where the EPC kind of future standards are going to be different, we have different advice with regards to that. In terms of introduction to climate change, we have a really nice introductory page on the second page of our report, which really kind of goes through what climate change is, how it's been modelled, and then talk about those representative concentration pathways that Mark spoke about, because it's something that's used within our report quite often, and there's so much terminology around climate change, and I understand that it's, it can be quite difficult to understand given varying amounts of knowledge on climate change, and especially for kind of the end user of this report, your clients, about whether they understand about climate change. So it's nice to have that introduction on there, and also kind of highlights what hazards we're particularly looking at and why we've included them. And then for each hazard, we have its own separate page, and we have sections in here which identify what the risk is and whether it's changed over time. We have a section on stress testing, which I'll go through in more detail as we go through the presentation. We also talk about next steps, and again, these are tailored to each of the different hazards that we're identifying, and then kind of helpful information in terms of why have we searched this particular risk and how will it be impacted by climate change. The report itself is separate from our environmental reports, mainly because when we first started to make this report, we had lots of advice from environmental lawyers, PSLs and conveyancers who all really kind of overwhelmingly said that they wanted it to be a separate report, something that they could recommend, but for clients to kind of to say whether they wanted it or not. And that's really what we're finding in the polls that we're seeing now, is that everyone's recommending it, but only ordering one when a client's requesting it. And mainly that's because of the types of transactions that you could potentially be dealing with, from short-term lease to a property that could be with a client for a lot longer, and therefore looking at risks can be very different to somebody who's doing short-term lease. So really kind of choice is key for climate change, it appears. So I just want to go through a few sections within our report just to highlight a few additional areas that we focus on. So one of those is on transition risks, which Mark has mentioned, and really it's us moving towards a lower carbon economy. The Law Society guidance specifically mentions transitional risks, and so when choosing a climate change report is something that you should be considering when you're looking for one. The key transitional risk that we've highlighted for real estate is property performance in buildings, because it affects the use and the sellability of a property going forwards, and especially in the UK, when we have the oldest housing stock in Europe, and it currently represents about 20% of our carbon emissions. And so if the UK are serious about hitting our net zero target by 2050, it's something that they're going to be looking at. And Mark's already mentioned about MEES and about having EPC rating of E or above, and that's potentially going to be more stringent to a EPC rating of C. So what we have in the report is a page kind of showing you what the current property rating is and what its potential it could be. And then for residential reports, we also kind of include a cost to how much it would potentially cost to retrofit the property to make sure that it improves its EPC efficiency. So that's really good if a person is buying a property that's got a very low EPC rating and wanting to improve it, and how much that could cost them in the future if they wanted to do so. And then the next section then is looking at stress testing, which is kind of highlighted here on the slide. The main reason for having stress testing is so that clients can have a look at, potentially it depends on how long they want to have the property for, but to be able to see how the risk may change depending on how long they have the property for and over different representative concentration pathways. So we've got 2.6 there, which is if we are aligned to the Paris Agreement, 4.5, which is our current trajectory, and then 8.5, which is kind of the worst case scenario where we're continuing to emit greenhouse gases. And you can see there that the more emissions that we produce over time, obviously the risks of climate change become worse. So it's important for clients to be able to see how that potential risk might change, rather than prescribing them just the current risk and the 2050. It's important to see the full picture for them to make a decision. And the Law Society guidance also mentions about continued learning, especially because it's a new topic. So one of the things that we have is the Landmark Academy, which has loads of free videos on there looking at environmental risks, and we have a new section up there on climate change, which gives a a clear introduction to what climate change is, through to kind of more technical webinars about policies and law. And we have a 4-part webinar series currently underway from Professor Robert Lee. But really do make use of that if you want to continue learning about climate change. And then what we also have is our landmark support pack, because again, it's something that's new. So after the session, we will be providing documents on our advice note and our client care letter that Mark's mentioned, about kind of how to set policies for your client care letter. So that's it from me. Thank you for attending the presentation. We've got another poll which we're set up about continued learning. So if we could just include that for a moment. So if you wouldn't mind just filling out this poll for us, that would be great. And I think after this, we've got some time for some questions. So if you have any questions at all, please feel free to put some questions in the chat, or you could always put your hand up and we can speak to you in person. Okay, thank you for doing the poll.
Thank you, Sally.
I'll just share my screen.
A couple of questions were sent in beforehand. I have a couple of those. If the effects of climate change reporting on listed buildings could be covered, that would be great. Why did I pick that one? So in terms of listed buildings, hopefully, I suppose that's something that may be touched on by the sector-specific guidance. Obviously, that's very specific to a niche area of real estate. In terms of physical risk changes, I suppose that approach is the same. You know, what's the flood risk now? Could that increase in the future? So in terms of the physical risk elements of climate change, then I suppose it's just as relevant as the current risk. You know, what is it now, and is it likely to change over I suppose a 30, 50-year period? I imagine that might be more in relation to transition risk and EPCs. I believe that listed buildings, there are dispensations for listed buildings at the moment, in the sense of you don't need to have an EPC if you can demonstrate the building is listed or officially protected, and the requirements would unacceptably alter the building. I believe that's what it says. I suppose in terms of that risk, it depends upon whether or not there are changes to MEES standards and MEES requirements, and whether there are changes to what they deem to be exempt. So difficult one to answer, really good question, but I suppose a difficult one to answer in terms of the practicality of how transition may change with that type of property. But again, physical risk, I suppose it's the same as reporting on flood risk now. It's just looking out to the future to see if that could potentially change, and an impact, I suppose, in insurance or lenders' tolerance of that property in the future. To what extent should we be referring to lenders on the basis of climate change indexes? This has come up before. It's something that I think Sally and I would like to probably catch up with our legal director on, who could provide a more legal standpoint. But no, I think lenders should specify what they need to say, and in what needs to be reported to them, and in what circumstances, as they do in the handbook. And I suppose that will be, I'm sure they are considering whether or not that would include climate change, and to what extent they will want to see that. So at the moment, I think it's really for lenders to specify themselves in terms of those Part B requirements. But I suppose from from a very cautious standpoint, again, I obviously don't have experience in the lender side of things. We provide search to lawyers. Sally, would you say it's something where there's a change, it's something that should be passed on? At what level?
Yes, definitely should be mentioned for sure.
Have any questions come through? No.
I can't see that any questions have come through yet.
What steps are the profession taking to mitigate the additional risk of climate change and property instructions? I don't know if that's from, I presume that's from, I can't answer that from, I suppose, the legal side, but from our side, I suppose there's three key things really that we're doing really to hopefully help with the profession, with property lawyers and conveyancers in helping through the process of understanding this risk and then starting to report on it with their clients. I suppose in the first instance is client care wording. Obviously, that's really important in the sense that there's a duty to warn, even though there's not a necessary duty to obtain the search in every case. So therefore, there is a freedom post warning your clients about how climate change could impact upon their acquisition. In terms of this freedom, in terms of what approach you want to take, as we discussed earlier, and thank you so much for those who filled in the polls about how you want to take that forward. So in the first instance, warning language to help you warn your clients, and I suppose initial discussions with your clients around what physical and transition risks are important, how that might impact the property in the future. I think a helpful search is really important. It is new. It's not a topic like contaminated land and flood risk where we are now familiar with them. So the search should be helpful. It should be clear, so that when you are picking it up and you are looking at it, it is in, I suppose, layman's terms. It's not using overly technical jargon, and there are explanations of how that assessment is being generated. I suppose what that means, I suppose, as well. So I think a clear search that provides clarity is important. It's not just something that's providing results and leaving you to deal with it. I think that's really key. And so whilst that might add a few more pages, and it's another reason why we kept it separate, is that we were able to create that. So whilst that does create a slightly longer report, that should help with the communication of risk and communication of specific topics. And the final thing that Sally picked up on at the end is platforms for education and training. The guidance does specifically set out that there's an understanding around competency and knowledge, I suppose, knowledge sharing, and so therefore tools and platforms where information can be accessed. Not necessarily, webinars such as this that Bristol put on are fantastic, because obviously it's a slot where we can go into some detail, but then outside of those slots, it's just fitting into, I suppose, everyone else's diary, in a sense of, well, I've got half an hour here or 20 minutes there. Platforms like the Landmark Academy hopefully help with that, because you can dive into it, you can go onto, you can see what you've watched already or listened to already or what you've read already, and pick up where you left off, I suppose, kind of thing. So I think
sorry, I think also kind of having some workshops as well, and that's something that we can help out with, is kind of having some internal workshops to kind of teach you about climate change and all of the risks and how it's changing in law, and keeping you up to date on all of those changes is really important as well.
Cool.
Before we wrap up the webinar, are there any more questions from the audience for Mark and Sally? We've got a couple of minutes left, so please do get them in the Q&A box and we will address them shortly. Do you have any further observations, Mark and Sally, that you can share with the audience?
No, not really. I suppose my final thing would be is what we started on at the outset. Is if you haven't read it, I think that's the most important thing in the immediate term is to get a copy and just find some time to read it, because it does set out some useful information. It does state what kind of risk could exist, and at the back it then looks at climate change in terms of the duties. But at the back there are some annexes where it does provide a bit more information, a bit more specific information to property transaction and conveyancing in general. So yeah, that would be really my key points. But yeah, Sally.
Yeah, no, I wouldn't say anything else to add, other than if anyone else has any additional questions at the end and they they want to ask us, and we can.
We've just had one posed by the audience. How specific is the report to a property, or is it more general about saying flooding on the region?
Yeah, that's a good question. It depends upon which risk you're talking about. So obviously, EPC, property specific. Flood risk, ground stability, yes, it's property specific because it's a factor of change. So it is relevant to the property. Now there are, obviously, I would state that if you're looking at, current risk is based upon a greater amount of data. So it's more data and there's more room for analysis of that. But whilst it is specific to the property, I suppose there are different in terms of how much data is being looked at to provide that opinion. But yeah, it's relevant to the property because it's a factor of increase.
Okay, we haven't had any further questions in, so I'm conscious that time is marching on. So I'd just like to say thank you so much, Sally and Mark, for a very informative webinar on climate change, and something that we're all going to have to adapt to fairly swiftly, I think. Just to remind the audience that we will send you a recording of this webinar and the accompanying documents, the slides and the client care letter that Sally and Mark referred to. That will be sent to you afterwards, but it'll probably be Monday now due to workflows and holiday. So we'll send that to you. Do keep an eye on our website for future webinars on this subject and all other events, and please do drop us a line if there is anything that you want us to showcase. So thank you so much, Mark and Sally, again, and hope you all have a good rest of the afternoon.